Battle of Cannae. In the summer of 216 BCE, during the Second Punic War, the Roman Republic faced one of the greatest military humiliations in its history. Near the small town of Cannae in southern Italy, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca orchestrated a battle so devastating that it remains the textbook example of battlefield annihilation. Rome had already suffered defeats at Hannibal's hands, but at Cannae they sought to crush him once and for all. The Romans marched with an army of nearly 80,000 men, the largest they had ever assembled, against Hannibal's force of roughly half that number. Confident in their numerical superiority, the Romans formed dense infantry columns and charged head-on, hoping sheer weight would overwhelm their enemy. But Hannibal had carefully prepared the battlefield. He placed his weakest troops in the center, with his veteran African infantry on the flanks and cavalry positioned to encircle. As the Romans pressed forward, the Carthaginian center deliberately bent back, creating the illusion of collapse. The Roman legions surged deeper, only to find themselves funneled into a deadly trap. At the critical moment, Hannibal's cavalry routed the Roman horsemen and swept behind the advancing legions. His infantry on the wings pivoted inward. In minutes, the Romans were surrounded on all sides, encircled in what historians call a double envelopment. Packed so tightly that they could barely raise their weapons, the Roman soldiers were cut down in waves. The slaughter was immense. Ancient sources claim up to 50,000 Romans died that day, including scores of senators and senior officers. Only a fraction of the army escaped. It was the single greatest battlefield defeat Rome had ever endured. Cannae became the nightmare that haunted Roman memory. For centuries afterward, generals studied it as the ultimate lesson in tactics and in the danger of arrogance. Hannibal's brilliance had shown that numbers alone cannot guarantee victory, and that strategy and deception can achieve what brute force never will. The Battle of Hastings. On October 14th, 1066, the rolling hills of southern England became the stage for one of the most decisive battles in medieval history. At Hastings, the fate of the English crown hung in the balance as King Harold Godwinson defended his throne against William, Duke of Normandy. A conflict that would permanently reshape the destiny of England. Harold had already been tested that year. Only weeks earlier, he had marched north to defeat a Viking invasion at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, winning a hard-fought victory but exhausting his troops. When word came that William had landed on England's southern coast, Harold forced his weary army to march more than 200 miles in a matter of days. At Hastings, he found the Normans waiting. The English formed a solid shield wall atop Senlac Hill, locking their shields together in a defensive line. Armed with axes and spears, they fought off repeated Norman assaults. For hours, Harold's army held firm, their position nearly unbreakable, but William's cavalry adapted. After feigned retreats tricked parts of the English line into breaking formation, Norman knights wheeled back and cut them down. As the battle raged, Harold himself became the target. According to tradition, immortalized in the Bayeux tapestry, the English king was struck in the eye by an arrow before being cut down by Norman soldiers. With their leader dead and their shield wall shattered, the English resistance collapsed. The aftermath was monumental. William, later known as William the Conqueror, claimed the English crown and introduced Norman rule. The conquest transformed England's culture, language, and aristocracy, laying the foundations of the medieval kingdom. The Battle of Hastings was brutal not only in its carnage, but in its consequences. A single day that ended one era and began another. The Battle of Agincourt. On October 25, 1415, muddy fields in northern France became the setting for one of the most celebrated victories in English history. At Agincourt, King Henry V of England faced a French army several times larger than his own. Exhausted, sick, and outnumbered, Henry's men nevertheless won a triumph that entered legend, and showed the brutal efficiency of the English longbow. Henry had invaded France during the 100 Years' War, but disease and fatigue ravaged his troops. As he attempted to march his small force back to the safety of Calais, the French intercepted him near Agincourt. Estimates suggest Henry commanded around 6,000 men, while the French fielded more than 20,000. By all logic, the English should have been annihilated. But the battlefield worked against the French. Heavy rains had turned the fields into deep mud. Henry placed his archers on the flanks, behind sharpened wooden stakes to fend off cavalry, while his men-at-arms formed a defensive line in the center. When the French advanced, waves of armored knights and infantry slogged through the muck, becoming easy targets. The English longbowmen loosed tens of thousands of arrows, piercing armor and sowing chaos. French knights fell, trampled one another, and clogged the battlefield. When the exhausted survivors reached the English line, they were met with ferocious resistance. Surrounded by mud and corpses, the French army collapsed. Thousands of nobles and knights were killed or captured, while English casualties were astonishingly light. The victory at Agincourt cemented Henry's reputation as a warrior king. Chroniclers hailed it as proof of divine favor, while Shakespeare immortalized it centuries later in his play, Henry the Fee. Yet behind the legend lay a grim truth. Agincourt was not just a victory, but a massacre. The field was littered with the bodies of France's finest, cut down by common bowmen in the unforgiving mud. The Siege of Tenochtitlan. In the summer of 1521, the mighty Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a city of canals, temples, and dazzling marketplaces, fell in one of the most brutal sieges in world history. What began as an alliance of Spanish conquistadors under Hernán Cortés and their indigenous allies became a months-long campaign of starvation, slaughter, and destruction that ended the Aztec Empire forever. Tenochtitlan was a marvel. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco, it was home to perhaps 200,000 people, making it larger than most European capitals at the time. Cortés and his forces, aided by rival indigenous groups hostile to Aztec dominance, laid siege to the city in May of 1521. With ships built on the lake, they blockaded supplies of food and water. Inside, famine and disease ravaged the population. Smallpox, introduced earlier by Europeans, tore through the crowded city, killing thousands even before Spanish steel struck. But the Aztecs resisted fiercely. Street by street, causeway by causeway, warriors defended their home with obsidian blades and relentless courage. The siege turned the grand city into a charnel house. Buildings collapsed in flames, canals filled with bodies, and hunger drove the population to desperation. By August, the resistance collapsed. Emperor Cuauhtémoc was captured as the Spanish tightened their grip. The once great Tenochtitlan was reduced to rubble, its temples burned, its survivors enslaved or scattered. Historians estimate that as many as 100,000 people died during the siege, from hunger, disease, and violence. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not just a battle. It was the end of an empire. In its place, Cortés built Mexico City, a symbol of Spanish conquest. Yet beneath its streets and stones, the memory of the Aztec capital still lingers, a reminder of how one of the world's greatest cities was brought low by fire, famine, and invasion. The Battle of Lepanto. On October 7, 1571, the waters of the Gulf of Patras off western Greece churned with one of the largest naval battles in history. The Holy League, a coalition of Christian states led by Spain, Venice, and the Papal States, clashed with the powerful Ottoman fleet in a struggle that would decide control of the Mediterranean. The stakes could not have been higher. For decades, the Ottoman Empire had expanded across Europe and the Mediterranean, dominating trade and threatening Christian kingdoms. At Lepanto, the Holy League assembled more than 200 galleys under the command of Don John of Austria, half-brother of King Philip II of Spain. Facing them was an Ottoman force of similar size commanded by Muezzinzadeh Ali Pasha, confident in their dominance at sea. The two armadas met in a thunderous collision of wood, iron, and flesh. Cannons roared, muskets cracked, and soldiers swarmed across decks in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Galleys rammed one another, splintering oars and capsizing ships. The sea turned red as thousands fell in battle, many drowning when their vessels sank. At the height of the struggle, Don John's flagship engaged Ali Pasha's directly. After fierce fighting, the Christian forces stormed the Ottoman galley, killing Ali Pasha and raising his severed head on a pike to demoralize the enemy. The sight shattered Ottoman morale. By day's end, more than 200 Ottoman ships were captured or sunk, and as many as 30,000 men lay dead. The victory at Lepanto was hailed across Europe as a turning point. It halted Ottoman naval expansion and restored confidence to Christian powers. The poet Cervantes, who fought at Lepanto and lost the use of his left hand, later called it the greatest occasion that past centuries have ever seen. Though the Ottomans would rebuild their fleet, they never again regained the same dominance at sea. Lepanto stands as one of history's most brutal and decisive naval battles, a clash not only of ships and soldiers, but of empires, faiths, and the fate of the Mediterranean world. The Battle of Naseby. On June 14, 1645, in the rolling fields of Northamptonshire, England, the English Civil War reached a decisive climax. The Battle of Naseby was the pivotal confrontation between King Charles I's royalist forces and the parliamentarian New Model Army. What began as a struggle over governance and the role of monarchy in England became one of the bloodiest and most politically consequential battles of the century. The Royalists, commanded by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, fielded about 9,000 men. Facing them was the New Model Army under Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell, numbering roughly 14,000. The two sides clashed on open ground near the village of Naseby, with both knowing the outcome could determine the future of England. At first, the Royalists seemed poised to win. Rupert's famed cavalry charged with ferocity, breaking through the parliamentarian left wing and chasing its troops from the field. But this success proved fatal. Instead of turning back, Rupert's horsemen pursued fleeing soldiers too far, leaving the main battle exposed. Meanwhile, Cromwell's disciplined cavalry on the parliamentarian right held firm, counterattacked, and then swept into the Royalist flank and rear. Surrounded, the Royalist infantry collapsed under relentless pressure. By the battle's end, more than 6,000 Royalists were killed, wounded, or captured, while parliamentarian losses were far lighter. The defeat was catastrophic for King Charles. He lost not only his best soldiers, but also his baggage train, which contained private correspondence that revealed his secret dealings with foreign powers. These documents were published by Parliament, undermining royal support further. Naseby effectively destroyed the king's ability to wage war. Though fighting continued, the royalist cause never recovered from the loss. The battle marked the moment when power shifted decisively toward Parliament, paving the way for the eventual trial and execution of Charles I. The Battle of Naseby was brutal, not just in bloodshed, but in its consequences. It ended the dream of absolute monarchy in England and ensured that the struggle for power between Crown and Parliament would shape the nation's future for centuries to come. The Battle of Blenheim. On August 13, 1704, the fields near the village of Blindheim in Bavaria became the site of one of the most decisive battles of the War of the Spanish Succession. Known as the Battle of Blenheim, it was a brutal clash that pitted the armies of France and Bavaria against the Grand Alliance, led by John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, and Prince Eugene of Savoy. The outcome would not only reshape the war, but also alter the balance of power in Europe. The French, under Marshal Tallard, fielded about 60,000 men alongside their Bavarian allies. Facing them was an allied force of similar size, but one that was more disciplined and better coordinated. Marlborough, a master of strategy, recognized that a decisive victory could break French dominance and prevent them from overrunning Vienna, the Habsburg capital. The battle raged across fields and villages. At Blenheim itself, French troops fought bitterly to hold their ground, but Marlborough launched relentless assaults to pin them down. Meanwhile, Prince Eugene engaged the Bavarians on the opposite flank, preventing them from reinforcing Tallard. In the center, the Allies executed a daring attack that split the French line in two, cutting off Blenheim from the rest of the army. The fighting was savage. Cavalry charges clashed in clouds of dust, muskets fired in volleys, and bayonets struck in brutal hand-to-hand combat. By day's end, the French position collapsed. Marshal Tallard himself was captured, along with thousands of his men. Casualties were immense. Over 30,000 French and Bavarian troops were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, while Allied losses numbered around 12,000. The victory at Blenheim was more than just a battlefield triumph. It shattered the myth of French invincibility under Louis XIV, saved Vienna from invasion, and turned the tide of the war. Marlborough's name became synonymous with brilliance. and Blenheim entered history as the moment when a united alliance humbled the mightiest army in Europe. The Battle of Borodino. On September 7, 1812, just 70 miles west of Moscow, the fields near the village of Borodino became the site of the bloodiest single-day clash of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte's Grand Armée and the Russian Imperial Army, commanded by General Mikhail Kutuzov, faced off in a battle that symbolized both the ferocity of Napoleon's campaign in Russia and the unimaginable human cost of war. Napoleon brought more than 130,000 troops to Borodino, determined to crush the Russian army and open the road to Moscow. Kutuzov, with roughly 120,000 men, prepared defensive earthworks and redoubts along the battlefield. Both sides knew the stakes. Moscow itself lay vulnerable, and the morale of Europe hinged on the outcome. The fighting began with French attacks on Russian fortifications, including the famed Bagration Flèche, arrow-shaped earthworks that changed hands multiple times in brutal combat. Musket volleys, cannon fire, and cavalry charges filled the air with smoke and blood. Casualties mounted at a horrifying rate as soldiers fought desperately for every mound and trench. By afternoon, Napoleon unleashed a massive assault on the Great Redoubt, the centerpiece of the Russian defenses. After hours of slaughter, French forces finally overran it, leaving heaps of dead on both sides. Yet Napoleon, wary of exhausting his reserves, held back his elite Imperial Guard, a decision that left the Russians bloodied but not destroyed. As night fell, both armies remained on the field, shattered but unbroken. The Russians eventually retreated in order, preserving their strength to fight again. Napoleon could claim a tactical victory. The road to Moscow was open, but at an enormous cost. More than 30,000 French casualties and 44,000 Russian losses. Borodino was a Pyrrhic triumph. The Grand Armée entered Moscow weeks later, only to find the city abandoned and burning. Without supplies, Napoleon's campaign unraveled in the brutal Russian winter. Borodino thus stands as a turning point, a battle where both sides bled heavily, and where victory on the field meant little in the greater tide of history. The Battle of Gettysburg. In July of 1863, the rolling hills of Pennsylvania became the stage for the largest and bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. Over 3 sweltering days, July 1st to July 3rd, Union and Confederate forces clashed at Gettysburg, leaving more than 50,000 casualties and transforming the war's trajectory. General Robert E. Lee, commanding the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, had invaded the North hoping to secure a decisive victory on Union soil. His opponent, General George Meade, led the Union Army of the Potomac, determined to halt Lee's advance. The collision began almost by accident, as Confederate troops searching for supplies encountered Union cavalry near the town of Gettysburg. What followed was a brutal engagement that spread across fields, ridges, and farmsteads. Day 1 saw Confederates push Union forces back through the town to defensive positions on Cemetery Hill. On Day 2, Lee launched massive assaults against the Union flanks at places now etched into memory: Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Wheat Field. Fighting was savage, with bayonet charges and hand-to-hand combat deciding ground measured in yards. The Union line bent, but did not break. The climax came on July 3rd when Lee ordered Pickett's charge, a bold frontal assault of 12,000 men across open fields toward the Union center at Cemetery Ridge. Under relentless artillery and rifle fire, the Confederate wave was shattered. Few reached the Union line, and fewer returned. Lee's army was forced to retreat south, battered and bloodied. The scale of death was staggering. More than 7,000 men were killed outright, with tens of thousands wounded or captured. Entire communities mourned as casualty lists grew. Gettysburg became a symbol of sacrifice and turning tides. President Abraham Lincoln would later consecrate the battlefield with the Gettysburg Address, reminding the nation that the struggle was not only about Union, but about freedom itself. Gettysburg endures as one of history's most brutal battles, a contest of courage, tragedy, and destiny that defined the fate of a nation. The Battle of Verdun. In February of 1916, the fields and forests near Verdun in northeastern France became the site of one of the longest and most brutal battles in human history. For nearly 10 months, German and French forces clashed in a relentless struggle that came to symbolize the horrors of the First World War. The German plan, conceived by Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn, was to bleed France white by targeting Verdun, a fortress city of immense symbolic importance. On February 21st, German artillery unleashed one of the most intense bombardments ever seen, firing millions of shells that turned villages, forts, and woodlands into wastelands. Entire landscapes were pulverized, craters overlapping so thickly that the earth looked like the surface of the moon. The French, under General Philippe Pétain, rallied with the famous cry, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. Reinforcements were rushed along the so-called Sacred Way, a single road kept alive by thousands of trucks and soldiers, ferrying supplies non-stop. The defense of Verdun became a matter of national pride, binding France together in shared sacrifice. The fighting was savage and unrelenting. Key forts such as Douaumont and Vaux changed hands multiple times, with soldiers enduring poison gas, flamethrowers, and endless artillery barrages. Men lived and died in mud-filled trenches, surrounded by corpses and rats. Every yard of ground was paid for with thousands of lives. By December, after nearly a year of continuous combat, the French had regained most of the lost territory. But the toll was staggering. Casualties reached an estimated 700,000 combined, with more than 300,000 killed. Verdun had no clear victor, only devastation. The Battle of Verdun became a symbol of endurance and futility, where national pride demanded that no ground be surrendered, regardless of the cost. It remains one of the most infamous examples of industrialized slaughter, where modern weapons turned war into a grinding machine of human flesh. The Battle of the Somme. On July 1, 1916, the Allies launched a massive offensive along the River Somme in northern France. It would become one of the bloodiest battles in history, stretching over 4 months and leaving more than 1 million men dead, wounded, or missing. The Somme was meant to break the stalemate of trench warfare, but instead it became a symbol of slaughter on an industrial scale. The British and French aimed to relieve pressure on Verdun, where the French army was being bled dry. At dawn on July 1st, after a week-long artillery bombardment that fired more than 1 million shells, British troops went over the top. They expected the German defenses to be destroyed. Instead, the bombardment had failed. German trenches were deep, reinforced with concrete, and largely intact. When British soldiers advanced across no man's land, they were met with relentless machine gun fire. The first day alone was catastrophic. Nearly 60,000 British casualties, including 20,000 dead, the single bloodiest day in British military history. Whole regiments were obliterated in minutes, cut down before reaching enemy lines. Still, the offensive continued. Over the next months, the battle dragged on through mud, barbed wire, and shell fire. Gains were measured in yards, not miles. The Somme also saw the first use of tanks in combat. Though primitive and unreliable, these armored vehicles marked a glimpse of future warfare. Air power, too, played a growing role as reconnaissance and dogfights became integral to the battlefield. Yet these innovations could not mask the human cost. By November, the Allies had advanced only about 6 miles. The Germans had suffered heavily as well, but the lines remained largely unchanged. With more than 1 million total casualties, the Battle of the Somme achieved little strategically, but seared itself into memory as the epitome of trench warfare's futility. The Somme remains a haunting testament to the human toll of modern war, courage consumed by mud, steel, and the merciless grind of industrialized killing. The Battle of Stalingrad. From the summer of 1942 to the winter of 1943, the city of Stalingrad on the banks of the Volga River became the stage for one of the most brutal and decisive battles in history. For 5 months, German and Soviet forces clashed in a struggle marked by ferocious street fighting, starvation, and unimaginable casualties. It was not only the bloodiest battle of the Second World War, but also the turning point that sealed the fate of Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler was determined to capture Stalingrad, a major industrial city and symbolic prize bearing Joseph Stalin's name. He ordered the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, to seize it at all costs. The Soviets, under Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Vasily Chukov, vowed to defend it to the last man. What followed was total war. The battle began with massive German air raids that reduced much of the city to rubble. Ironically, the ruins became a defensive advantage for the Soviets, who turned every building, factory, and cellar into a fortress. Fighting devolved into a nightmarish struggle where soldiers battled room by room, armed with knives, grenades, and even shovels. Snipers hunted across shattered streets, and the Volga itself became a lifeline as Soviet reinforcements ferried across under relentless fire. By November, the Germans controlled most of the city, but their army was exhausted and overstretched. Then the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that encircled Paulus's forces. Trapped in the freezing ruins with no supplies, the Sixth Army endured starvation, frostbite, and constant bombardment. Hitler ordered Paulus to fight to the death, but on February 2, 1943, the remnants of the German army surrendered. The cost was staggering. Estimates suggest nearly 2 million casualties combined, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire divisions vanished, and the once proud Sixth Army was obliterated. Stalingrad was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological blow that shattered the myth of German invincibility. For the Soviets, it became a symbol of resilience and sacrifice. The battle's brutality, measured in blood and rubble, stands unmatched as the ultimate testament to the horrors of modern urban warfare. The Battle of Kursk. In July of 1943, the plains of Western Russia became the stage for the largest tank battle in history. At Kursk, the German Wehrmacht sought to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front after its devastating defeat at Stalingrad. What followed was a clash of steel and fire on an unprecedented scale. A brutal confrontation that sealed the fate of Nazi Germany in the East. The Germans launched Operation Citadel, a massive offensive designed to pinch off the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet line. Fielding nearly 3,000 tanks, including the fearsome Tiger and the new Panther, they hoped to cut through Soviet defenses and encircle Red Army forces. Facing them were more than 3,000 Soviet tanks, deeply entrenched behind minefields, trenches, and anti-tank defenses, carefully prepared by Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Konstantin Rokossovsky. The battle opened on July 5th with ferocious German assaults north and south of Kursk. Progress was slow, as minefields and artillery chewed up advancing panzers. Soviet troops fought tenaciously, trading ground for time. On July 12th, the battle reached its climax near Prokhorovka, where nearly 1,000 tanks clashed in close-quarters combat. The fields erupted in smoke and fire as steel behemoths rammed, burned, and exploded. The losses were staggering. Thousands of tanks were destroyed, and tens of thousands of men were killed or wounded. While the Germans inflicted heavy casualties, their momentum stalled. With fresh Soviet reserves pouring into the fight, the Red Army counterattacked. By mid-July, the Germans were forced to retreat, their last major offensive in the east decisively halted. Kursk marked a turning point. From that moment forward, the Soviet Union maintained the strategic initiative, pushing westward relentlessly until Berlin fell 2 years later. For Germany, Kursk was a disaster that drained its armored strength. The Battle of Kursk was more than a clash of armies. It was the epitome of mechanized warfare's brutality. It proved that the tide of war in the East had turned irrevocably, and that sheer industrial might, combined with determination, could overcome even the most formidable war machine. The Battle of Hue. In January of 1968, during the Vietnam War, the city of Hue became the epicenter of one of the bloodiest urban battles in modern history. The conflict erupted during the Tet Offensive, a massive surprise campaign launched by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces across South Vietnam. Of all the battles fought in that offensive, none matched the scale or ferocity of Hue. The city of Hue, once the imperial capital of Vietnam, was both strategically and symbolically vital. On January 31st, communist forces launched a coordinated assault, seizing most of the city within hours. South Vietnamese and American troops were caught off guard, and Hue fell almost entirely into enemy hands. Only a few strongholds, the U.S. Military Assistance Command compound and some bases south of the Perfume River, held out. The counterattack was immediate but brutal. American Marines and South Vietnamese forces were ordered to retake the city block by block. The fighting was unlike much of the Vietnam War, which had been fought in jungles and villages. In Hue, it was house-to-house combat, where every street, building, and wall became a battleground. Artillery, tanks, and airstrikes pulverized historic neighborhoods as Marines engaged in close-quarters battles with entrenched Viet Cong fighters. For nearly a month, the battle raged. By late February, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces had retaken Hue, but the cost was staggering. Casualties numbered more than 10,000, including thousands of civilians killed in the crossfire or executed by communist forces during their occupation. The once beautiful city was reduced to rubble, its imperial citadel scarred by shellfire and bloodshed. The Battle of Hue was a turning point in perception. Although technically a victory for American and South Vietnamese forces, the scale of destruction and casualties shocked the public. Televised footage and graphic reporting undermined U.S. confidence in the war effort. For many, Hue symbolized both the brutality of the conflict and the futility of its continuation. The Battle of Fallujah. In November of 2004, the city of Fallujah in Iraq became the site of the fiercest urban battle fought by American forces since the Vietnam War. Known as the Second Battle of Fallujah, it was launched by U.S. Marines, Army units, and Iraqi government troops to retake the city from insurgents who had turned it into a stronghold of resistance against the American-led occupation. Fallujah had become a symbol of insurgent defiance. Fighters loyal to al-Qaeda in Iraq, along with other militant groups, fortified the city with barricades, improvised explosive devices, and sniper nests. Intelligence estimated that thousands of insurgents were dug in, prepared to turn every street and house into a battlefield. Operation Phantom Fury began on November 7th. The assault opened with massive aerial and artillery bombardments, reducing blocks of the city to rubble. American Marines then advanced block by block, encountering ferocious resistance. Every building had to be cleared room by room. Insurgents used tunnels, booby traps, and ambushes to inflict heavy casualties. The fighting was intimate and unrelenting. Rifles, grenades, and close-quarters combat in smoke-filled corridors. Over the course of 6 weeks, Fallujah was systematically dismantled. Entire neighborhoods were leveled as Marines fought through mosques, hospitals, and homes turned into fortresses. By mid-December, U.S. forces had seized control, though at great cost. More than 100 American soldiers were killed, with thousands wounded. Insurgent losses were far heavier, estimated in the thousands, and much of the city was left in ruins. For civilians, the toll was devastating. Hundreds of thousands fled the fighting, while those who remained endured hunger, destruction, and the terror of war in their streets. The city's infrastructure lay in rubble, and its scars remain visible to this day. The Battle of Fallujah was brutal not only in its destruction, but in its symbolism. It showcased the intensity of urban warfare in the 21st century, where heavily armed forces confronted insurgents embedded in civilian environments. It also revealed the immense human cost when cities themselves become battlefields. Thank you for watching. If you learned anything, throw me a like and comment below on what you would like to see in the future. History never runs out of surprises, and neither do we. So subscribe and join me for the next dive into the archives.